Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. I am joined today by Dr. Luke Messac. He is an emergency physician and historian. He's the author of the new book, Your Money or Your Life: Debt Collection in American Medicine. He has also written about medical debt for the excellent magazine Current Affairs, and you can check him out in The Nation, where he has a new piece on why doctors should organize. Luke Messac, thank you for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, it's nice to talk to you finally. I suppose you're a historian. You've gone into the archives. You've looked at the entire history of medical debt. You've looked at all the trade journals. You've interviewed tons of people for this book. This book, there's a mountain of research that went into this book, and you have many, many, many stories of people experiencing medical debt. But I want to go to the story that you opened the book with, because clearly you opened it with a reason. So you begin with a particularly disturbing story from the 1990s of a bit of indentured servitude branded as a humane innovation. And maybe you could tell us about that.
Absolutely. And this is part of what kicked off this research project, realizing that these kinds of stories were out there. This particular story was of a woman who was a widow, a recent widow. Her husband had recently passed after a prolonged hospitalization at a hospital in Southern Virginia, and facing a bill for his care that she could not hope to pay, the hospital offered her what it's called its service credit program, in which she could work in the hospital laundry for $5 an hour to try to repay the debt from her deceased husband's hospital stay. And so at 68 years old, she was made to toil in the hospital laundry, which I can tell you is no easy job, to try to repay this debt.
Of all the blood and the shit and stuff, presumably.
It's gruesome. And the hospital was quite proud of this program. I think it was the tone with which the hospital spoke of the program that shocked me the most. They were lauding this program. They were using their PR department to sell it to reporters. The way I came across it was in the Richmond Post-Dispatch, where they wrote about their work as it was conferring dignity upon patients for the ability to repay their debts. And these were oftentimes in other hospitals that did similar work. These were by definition low-income patients. You had to be sometimes living below the poverty level to qualify for this care. And so to me, I was shocked that this would exist in the United States, that would exist as late as the 1990s, and that hospitals would not simply just offer these patients charity care and write it off entirely. But this is the kind of decision that patients are made to make.
Well, you talk about the way that they tout this as you say, this program to allow people, to help people who are in debt. And what you gotta say, one of the only reasons that this is able to even be branded as something that is humane and better than the alternative is because the alternative is so terrible. The ordinary way of doing business, the ordinary practices of debt collection might, in fact, be even worse, or are quite terrible at least. So let's go from that particularly gruesome and depressing anecdote to the ordinary practices of debt collection that was supposed to be an improvement on.
Yeah, absolutely. And in some ways, you could say that it was. Because if you have a medical debt, let's talk about the present. If you have medical debt and you don't repay it within the first few months, then the hospital can resort to what are called extraordinary collection actions. It's a legal term that includes anything from reporting your debt to a credit bureau or selling your debt to a third party, to taking you to court, garnishing your wages, putting a lien on your home, foreclosing on your home. And if you don't show up for these hearings, even seeking your arrest. So the lengths to which a hospital can and sometimes will go to seek to collect your debt are truly draconian.
And, you document that because debt collection companies have a very strong incentive. It's their business model to squeeze as much money out of people who don't want to pay as they possibly can. That leads them to do awful things to people. It leads them to, try and make people cry, try and make people feel ashamed, menace people, show up at their house. So tell us about a little bit about the practices of debt collection agencies.
Yeah, I mean, debt collection is a huge, huge industry. I didn't realize before I did this work how big it was and how large some of the companies are, how wealthy some of the magnates within the industry are, just who it includes. Debt collection companies are run by former members of Congress, they're run by owners of NBA teams, but they will resort to some pretty draconian tactics in order to collect. They will buy or receive this debt on contingency from hospitals, and they'll pay pennies on the dollar essentially, and in the expectation that they will be able to collect relatively little of it. These are poor patients almost by definition, and they cannot repay these debts. And so hospitals will sell it to them for a pittance, and then it's kind of open season on the patient. The debt collector can sometimes end up resorting to really aggressive measures to try to collect. And some of the stories I do tell are, from congressional testimony in which debt collectors recount how reducing a patient on the other end of the line to tears was seen as a, quote, badge of honor. And, in some ways, the whole thing is really a tragic tale because a lot of the people seeking to collect the debt, that is the rank and file debt collectors, the people on the other end of the phone line, are themselves working low wage jobs with tremendously terrible working conditions. So it's really the poor collecting from the poor for the benefit of the rich in this case.
To get rich off the poor, you have to be quite ruthless because the poor, by definition, don't have much money. As you mentioned, one of the kind of remarkable things about medical debt is that, as you say, they often don't collect much money. They don't succeed in collecting much money. You investigated the practices in your own hospital system, and it was kind of extraordinary that there was all this cruelty in the form of these lawsuits, but it doesn't actually yield much for the hospitals.
Yeah, some of the best studies of this were done in Virginia. It's hard to study debt collection in general because the court records aren't always digitized. Sometimes they're hard to access. But some of the ones that have been studied, say in Virginia, have shown that debt collection by hospitals garners a very small portion of the hospital's overall revenue. And these kinds of third-party and extraordinary collection actions, lawsuits in particular, are really not helping a hospital's bottom line. The average amount in Virginia was 0.1% of a hospital's revenue that was accounted for by these lawsuits. So it's really not worth it to a hospital in many ways, reputationally and financially, to resort to these measures that really leave patients in a bind. Part of the history I tell is that hospitals and physicians in particular have become more and more divorced from the actions that are taken against patients in order to collect these debts. And so people involved in clinical care, people with the social bonds to the patients, really have very little to do with the collections actions on the other end. And so to those folks involved in the debt collection, this is really just a matter of dollar and cents. These are just numbers on a spreadsheet. They're not necessarily patients with whom they have personal relationships.
Yeah, because my question to you was going to be, well, if it's not that beneficial to hospitals, why? Why do this? Why do this to your patients?
That's the thing that got me so much. I couldn't figure it out for a while. And I think one of the things I realized was that a lot of it's just a matter of convenience. I mean, the sales pitch that the debt collection companies will make to hospital billing and collections departments is, listen, you don't want to spend all your time calling patients trying to collect from them. You don't want to do that. That's not your work. It's below you. Like, let us do that. We are the experts. You'll make some money. Some of it's guaranteed if you sell it to us. Just let us handle it, make a little money off of it, and then take it off your plate. Hospitals have trouble even hiring people who want to make these sorts of phone calls to low-income patients. And so the sales pitch is actually something of this convenience argument, or this, getting rid of something they don't want to do anyway, even if it doesn't make them much money.
You tell the story in the book of your own investigations into your own employer's practices, where you found court records and you saw that, that low-income people at your own hospital were being sued on behalf of the hospital. One of the things that struck me in that story is that, when the vice president confronted you about it, they denied it for so long. And I don't even know if you ever figured out whether they were sincere that they didn't know that this was even happening. They insisted, no, we don't sue people over medical debt. Lying to your face.
Yeah. I mean, at first I thought it was a bald-faced lie. At this point, I do believe what he was telling me, that he didn't actually know what the hospital was doing. I think so few people know what their third-party debt collectors are doing. It's really not an excuse. I mean, hospitals have the ability to stipulate in their contracts, even the debt that they sell, what sorts of measures can be used. But I do believe that a lot of the people, even in the administration, don't know this is going on. And so it really was a lesson for me in just how divorced even hospital administrators have become from this process.
You wrote about this publicly, these lawsuits, that you went and found the court records of the patients from the hospital being sued over the debt, and they tell you, what are you talking about? We don't do this.
Yeah. I mean, eventually one of the things they told me was that they had previously known that this debt collector was too aggressive for them. They told me eventually that they thought they had told them to stop, but they hadn't stopped. They had continued. And so finally, after I had that meeting with them, showed them the court records, they severed the relationship completely and pulled back their inventory, which was a good step and a small drop in the bucket of the problem. But it did go to show that once you form a partnership with someone who's willing to do this to patients, it's going to be hard on everybody, especially the patients.
The other big why question that came across when I was reading your own account of what you saw in your system was, I think you said it was a non-profit teaching hospital, and public interest suggests in it for the patients, not for someone else to get rich. The word teaching suggests the same thing, which is that we're here for educational purposes. Why would a nonprofit teaching hospital be engaged in this?
Yeah, that was one of the most shocking things to me, and something that's come up again and again in recent reporting about these practices. They're often large nonprofit teaching hospitals that receive tax exemptions and a large measure of public subsidy for this work. I think history is important to bring in here. Hospitals, large number of them, most of the nonprofits we have today, they came from the almshouse tradition. They came from almshouses or charitable associations or ethnic associations that were set up to explicitly to care for the poor, and they did not collect fees by and large at their founding. Eventually, they started to draw in more paying patients in the early 20th century when people started to want to go to hospitals to get some of the new technological advances, new surgeries. And by the mid-century, especially after the passage of Medicare, Medicaid, and the rise of private insurance, hospitals started to argue that their role as charitable institutions had largely changed and faded away. And the IRS agreed with them. An IRS lawyer named Robert Bromberg changed the formulation or the stipulations that hospitals had to abide by in order to qualify as tax-exempt nonprofit institutions from a requirement to provide charity care to the extent of their financial ability to one that really was very lax and said that hospitals could spend on a number of measures that didn't have to include charity care in order to qualify for tax exemption. So now hospitals will build gleaming new buildings and say, this is our community benefit, this high rise that
they can come and look at
afford. Yeah. People in the neighborhood or people in the area who are low income, they can't afford to actually get care here. But this is a community benefit, this new gleaming center.
They can be proud that it's here.
Amen.
Well, yeah. So you've touched on their history because you are a historian, and one of the interesting things that you do in this book, Your Money or Your Life, available from Oxford University Press, is that you answer the question, well, were things always this way? How did this all come about? What landed us here? And, you document that it's patchy, right? There are practices from the past that are worse. And the one that's stuck with me is that sometimes you could hire a lady who would come to your house with a big voice, and she would shout at debtors and embarrass them by screaming outside of their house in their workplace. And it did think, well, I'm glad that has gone away so far. I mean, I kind of wish you hadn't disclosed this because I feel like it will give them ideas. But also, as you say early on, there's this idea of the almshouse, the idea of a hospital as a charitable institution, and you have all this archival material from doctors and journals where they speak in kind of language about, like obviously, where you help the poor for free, that language that sounds very radical today.
Yeah, that was really interesting to me. I mean, there have been other historians who've written on this, and I draw from some of their work in some of the early chapters. It was amazing that in the 19th century, in the 1800s, a lot of physicians were lamenting the fact that they couldn't collect their fees. These were at the time personal relationships. The doctor would come to your home to treat you and then seek to collect maybe on a quarterly or annual basis. And oftentimes patients would say, my crop didn't come in this year. I have another family member who's sick. I can't afford to pay. And then that personal negotiation had to go on where the doctor had to decide what they would do. Would they delay the bill? Would they forget it altogether? Would they sever the relationship? And so this was a personal decision the doctor had to make. And sometimes they would take to writing, in journals, as you say. And then one wrote to a journal with verse. He wrote a poem, book, oh doctor, book your fee, charge, I'll pay it futurely. People, they just couldn't get their money. And to some extent, that was seen as a professional obligation, that you should have a measure of lenience toward patients who couldn't pay, and you should treat them anyway. It wasn't always abided by, but it was seen as a commonly understood obligation. But that really has fallen by the wayside. I mean, I personally don't want to be involved in debt collection in any way. And in some senses, I like the fact that I don't know how much patients are going to be made for any given thing, because I can tell them that I am completely divorced from the process of debt collection, but I don't want them to have debts collected thereafter anyway. The charge at the point of care should be $0. That is the only way that, care is going to be affordable.
Well, you talk throughout the book of the way that this kind of separation between the doctors and the financial side of it, which, as you say, ideally there would be a separation of doctors and the financial side, but there wouldn't be a financial side. But you point out that the fact that if you ask your doctor, as your patients have asked you, how much am I going to pay for this? How much is this going to cost? The doctor says, speaking honestly, I have no idea. I'll go ask someone else. And then they go, I have no idea either. And then they come back and go, I'm sorry, nobody here has any idea how much you're going to pay. As you point out, this harms the doctor-patient relationship, because when the person gets their bill, they see you as part of a big swindle.
Yeah, there's a number of reasons why this is wrong. But I think, some people will hear that story and say, well, why not just price transparency? Why not just post our list prices on hospital websites, as actually federal law requires hospitals to do currently, although many don't? That's not really the answer either. I mean, people go to hospitals in moments of duress. They do not have the time or inclination or ability to shop around when they are feeling the symptoms of a heart attack or a stroke. I do not want them shopping for the best deal in that circumstance. I want them to go as quickly as possible to call 911 and come to the hospital right away. And I don't want them worrying for 1 minute that it's going to cost them too much for them to do that.
Yes, because we can imagine fixing the problem by, okay, well, we'll tell the doctors the prices. Then we run that situation again. So the person says, "Hi, doctor, how much is this going to cost?" And the doctor looks at the sheet and goes, $4,000. Then the person goes, "Oh, well, then I'm not getting it. I'm leaving." And the doctor's like, no, you need this. It's important. Please stay. And they're like, "But I can't pay $4,000. I'm leaving." And then you, as the doctor, have now caused a person to not get care that they need, because you've been able to honestly tell them the price. They've done a calculation in their head that they'd rather be sick than broke, and they have to go.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the people I admire the most, the people I've learned medicine from, people like the late Paul Farmer, really giant of social medicine, said that the out-of-pocket spending approach, which he called the OOPS approach, out-of-pocket spending, was really a formula for disaster. Really was, the act of making patients pay at the point of care for healthcare that they need is a mortal drama. It results in mortality. We have studied this time and again, and we keep coming up with the same result. And yet we keep insisting that it just can't be so. And a lot of the other countries that have passed single-payer healthcare systems or other forms of universal healthcare, they face the same drama too. And passing those systems was very challenging, very difficult. In the UK, the advocates of National Health Service were likened to Nazis. But today, those systems are the most treasured public institutions in those countries, and we can do the same here.
I recently got a surprise bill because a year ago I had COVID and my heart started feeling weird or something around my heart. So I went to clinic and I saw someone that I didn't get billed for nearly a year, and then they sent me a $500 bill, which was after my insurance. And I thought, $500, Jesus. Well, next time my heart feels weird, I'm not gonna go and have anyone see it. I'm not going to spend $500 on that nonsense. I'm just going to live with it. And then I was like, well, this is how people die.
Yes. There's a term for this in the literature. One, it's called foregone care, right? You needed care. You might not seek it in the future. And the other is financial toxicity. The effects of the financial system on healthcare, on the effects of these debts is truly toxic. It is embodied in our lives. It leads people to poor health outcomes. I worry more about the patients who don't show up in my ED than the patients who do, the patients who stay home too long than the patients who come in.
I wanted to try and find, but I don't think I'm going to succeed in finding, a passage towards the end of your book where you talk about, you use the word sacred to describe what the kind of relationship between the doctor and patient, especially religious person, but this is the word that kind of comes to mind to describe what this ought to be. That is to say, it should not be polluted by anything transactional. It should be pure. It should be, I am a person in need of care. You are a person who is there to give me care. The only questions in the two parties' minds are, one, what do I need? And the other person saying, what do you need? And let's have the one person give the other person what they need. But when you start to introduce any kind of financial element, it's what do I need and how much is it going to cost? Can I afford it? And then the doctor has to worry, well, am I hurting this person more than I am helping them by taking their money while I give them care?
Yeah, this idea came from, it's some sense a commonsensical notion, but there was a sociologist, Emil Durkheim, who wrote about the profane and the sacred. The profane, he was discussing basically the hurly-burly of everyday life and market relations and, buying and selling and making the best deal for yourself and getting ahead. That's the profane. That's the world we live in often. But there is this other realm, the sacred, where those kinds of thoughts, those kinds of relations shouldn't apply. And I think in patients' greatest moments of vulnerability, when they really need someone to look after them and not to introduce any other sorts of considerations or harm, when that should be the only thing on any of our minds. That is my vision, my ideal of what healthcare can and should be. And I think that's part of why it does stem a lot from the religious tradition, the almshouse tradition in which hospitals find their origins. And I think there is part of that we should hold on to. The past was not perfect,
No.
and we shouldn't idolize it. But there are some notions that we should cling to.
Yes, rather than the business tradition of commoditizing everything.
Yeah, that's been dangerous. That's been extremely destructive.
Well, someone might hear what you're saying and think, yes, what an uplifting and beautiful vision, but it's impossible. But you begin, before your introduction, you have a quote from David Graeber from the Utopia of Rules, who said, the ultimate hidden truth of the world is that it's something we make and could just as easily make differently. So let's talk about how things could actually be different and why it's practical. I actually just got off the phone with my grandmother, who is 89, and she lives in a magical place for healthcare called the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Some of our listeners may have heard of it. She has, had heart trouble. She was recently taken to the hospital. She's doing all right, but they want to keep her for a couple of days. And I told her that I was interviewing an author today who had written a book about medical debt. And then I had to explain to her that medical debt is when you leave the hospital, you're pursued for money. Whereas she just went to the hospital, is going to be there a couple of days, and she doesn't have to think, oh my God, 2 days in the hospital, how much is this going to cost? So it could be different, could it not?
Yeah, I'm glad to hear your grandmother's doing better. I hope you're feeling better too, by the way.
I'm good. This was a year ago. I didn't get the bill for a year.
Oh, gosh. Yeah. These examples, I think, are illustrative. I'll talk about Canada for a second. Tommy Douglas, the socialist premier of Saskatchewan, Baptist minister, he passed what was then called Medicare, their single-payer healthcare system in that province, and then helped expand it to the entire country. When he did that, the doctors went on strike briefly, and they said they would never participate in this system. And soon enough, they did. And now Tommy Douglas is regularly cited as the greatest Canadian in polls, also the father of Donald Sutherland and the grandfather of Kiefer Sutherland. So he's done so much for the world. But, these are examples not to show you that things are so much better someplace else, but that they need not be as they are here. Margaret Atwood, the author, she writes about how her own mother and father were for a time threatened with being detained at the hospital in Canada when her brother was born, that they wouldn't let them out until they paid, and her family didn't have enough to pay. This was regular practice, not to let people leave until they could pay. And this is still a practice that goes on around the world, medical detention. It exists. But we don't have to live in that dystopia. There's plenty of other examples of places that are not utopian, but are much better.
Yeah, you cross the Detroit River and you can see an example of how we could live differently. It's really heartbreaking. You have some crazy stories of the desperation. There's a guy. There's a story from I think the 1970s. The guy who hijacked a plane because he needed money to pay for his 8-year-old child's operation. And you think, again, like when you speak to people in Britain, they're just, these things just strike them as so crazy because when they need something, they just go, they schedule an appointment and they go and they have it done.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I resorted to some of the most egregious examples, but I think that they do show something. They do show, like, I mean, I have an example in the book of a child who died in the 1980s of AIDS after receiving a blood transfusion at a hospital. His family was not informed that he died of AIDS. They said it was medical jargon that they couldn't understand. They only learned after some other families had similar losses at the same hospital. And then they received a bill and were taken to court over bills they hadn't paid for the care of their son who had passed away as a result of care at that hospital. Like, these are horrific stories, but they do show you what becomes of us when we resort to these measures. We need not do it, but it turns us into things we wouldn't recognize.
That's an important point. We all become less human. It feels like, I know that a lot of doctors, in fact, my colleague who edited your article is an ex-doctor who in part left the profession because she just didn't like the role she was having to play in this system. It just felt very ugly. It didn't feel like, and in fact, we interviewed Dr. Mark Vonnegut, who wrote a great book called The Heart of Caring, where he talks about how the financialization of the industry, how insurance companies and debt collectors have really made being a doctor. I mean, you talk about feelings of guilt, right?
Yeah, guilt, shame, powerlessness, which is strange to think. I mean, you're invested as a physician with so much authority. You have the ability to prescribe very powerful medications and to reach into people's bodies to try to ameliorate their ills. But at the same time, you feel drained of power, drained of the ability to do right by your patients. When you see what they're going through, when you're made to make phone call after phone call to try to get the bare basics. And when you see patients, I see patients in the ED who come in with complications of diabetes because they can't afford insulin, patients who showed up too late because they were afraid of the charges. And you know how powerful medicine is and how much good it can do. I still am a really firm believer in the power of medicine and its ability to provide, moral and physical well-being for patients if done correctly. But we're just not doing it right. We're just allowing so many rentiers and profit maximizers to skim off the top to the extent that we can't do right by our patients anymore. There's too many people making too much money off of our patients.
Well, that gets us to the article that you just published in the Nation magazine, which is about why medical professionals, why doctors should organize. I mean, you talk about how doctors and nurses often in these giant corporate hospitals might be reasonably well paid, but they become relatively powerless within this system to decide how things are going to operate. And presumably, if we're able to organize, they could build power over these institutions and try and kind of reshape them in a way that actually put the interests of those that they got into the profession to help first.
Yeah, physicians tend to see themselves in kind of ideal terms as independent professionals. We control our own destinies and we get to determine what happens in our professional lives. But this idea of the physician starting an independent practice, hanging out a shingle and going on home visits, that's a nice bit of nostalgia, Americana, that you'll see sometimes on old television shows. But for most of us, that's not something we ever do. Most of us end up working as employees in large corporations or organizations like nonprofit hospitals or for-profit hospitals. or even for private equity or insurance companies, which are buying a lot of physician practices. So we are employees. We are not independent any longer. 74% of us work for these larger entities. And so we have to start thinking of ourselves in those terms and then learning from other employees, other workers who have organized. A lot of the most sanguine, most hopeful examples from my book come from nurses unions or food service worker unions in hospitals who organized to help prevent and stop hospitals from suing low-income patients, many of whom were their own members. So, we too can learn those examples, become organized. A lot of physicians are already doing this. Resident physicians, that is physicians in specialty training, they have started to unionize in large numbers at some of the largest academic medical centers. And they've passed their unionization votes in landslide votes in the last few years. So this is, I think, a really hopeful turn towards, honesty and the scales falling from our eyes and understanding where we sit in the system and understanding the class relations, the power relations that we actually, are a part of, and then allying with the right people. We're no longer independent, and we can't delude ourselves into thinking we're making all the decisions. We have to form alliances with patients and with other healthcare workers.
Well, as you know, here at Current Affairs, we believe very strongly in what David Graeber said that you quote in your book about, how we make the world and we could make it differently. And I want to touch on what you wrote about in your article for our magazine, because you wrote an article on the forgiveness of debt, why medical debt forgiveness drives are not enough. Because there's been a response, there was a response from a lot of activists when medical debt became a decade or so ago, big issue that people started paying attention to, which was, if the debt sells for pennies on the dollar, we could buy up the debt and we could forgive it. And a lot of people were very excited about this because it seemed a way to combat this injustice. So I want to first ask you, the argument for why medical debt forgiveness drives are not enough. And then I'm going to ask you about, what do we do instead?
The people who are involved in forgiving medical debt are well-intentioned and really admirable people. And it started off as a really radical critique. This came out of the Occupy Wall Street movement, where people like David Graeber and Astra Taylor found out that you could buy medical debt on the secondary market and forgive it. And so they used it as an example to show people, look at this medical debt that exists. Look at the people who are buying and selling it for profit, and look at the people it's harming. And they used it as an example to not only relieve suffering in the here and now by forgiving the debt, but also to show the real egregious nature of our system and what had to be changed. But over time, that kind of became institutionalized, and now there's charitable drives to forgive medical debt, and those do help individuals, but they also solidify a system that we just can't continue to live with. When you forgive someone's medical debt, that medical debt was often purchased. Sometimes it was purchased from debt collectors. Sometimes it was purchased from hospitals who should have just allowed that to be written off as charity care in the first place and never pursued it in that way. So we're really continuing a system that should be no longer. At one time, a radical critique of the system, and now it's become a little bit too comfortable with it, was my contention.
Well, paying someone's medical bills in a GoFundMe campaign is a very nice thing to do that helps people. But ultimately, we have to ask the question, why are so many people having to plead with strangers to help them at their sickest, most desperate moments to toss them a few dollars on GoFundMe? It seems really unfair. Okay, so if medical debt forgiveness drives are not enough, what would be enough? What do we need?
All right, 2 steps. 1, forgive all of the medical debt at once. Bernie Sanders actually proposed this in his 2020 campaign. He said, we can just forgive all of the medical debt. He didn't say exactly how it would happen. Some of the people who started some of the groups that do these medical debt forgiveness drives estimated the cost. They said it would probably cost about $500 million, which sounds like a lot, but is a drop in the bucket of the federal budget.
It's not actually that much.
Yeah. This is if you wanted to pay off the debt collectors and the hospitals and give them like a market price for that debt. So if you even allowed that system to exist, then you'd pay that much money and forgive all the medical debt. Now, that's not enough because medical debt would continue to accrue unless you stopped it from doing so. And how would you do that? Well, by ensuring that point of care payments for medicine, for medical care, no longer existed. And that would require some form of universal health care. Single payer is probably the best way. That means getting rid of insurance companies that are really just middlemen without providing, care for patients, and just allowing care to be paid for by progressive taxation. So that would be the best way, but there are other ways as well that some other European and countries around the world have taken up. But we really have to figure out a way to prevent patients from building up medical debt and then forgive the medical debt that exists. Those are the two steps. They both are within our reach and incredibly popular. So those are the two things that I'm going to be pushing for the rest until we make it happen.
Well, I hope everyone picks up your new book, Your Money or Your Life, available from Oxford University Press, because I think you document, I think even just looking into the history helps expand our imaginations, because we understand that the exact arrangement of things as they are now is not even the way that they have always been everywhere in our own country, let alone around the world. And so we have to have that understanding to fuel our determination and our confidence that this horrible, preventable injustice can finally be wiped away and doctors can get back to what they do best, which is taking care of people who are sick. Dr. Luke Messac, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs Today.
Thanks so much for having me. Real honor.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.